The back door was the latest in a line of doors spanning centuries, each hung and taken down, framed to shut out the world, and failing when ajar, gusting winds cast crumbs of soil across the threshold into the kitchen, or clods dropped from muddy boots of those returning from working the land. This evening it was Keith's boots that shed frosty flakes after slamming the door behind him. "Any luck finding those old clothes?" he shouted. "Just these dirty old rags," answered Kath, chucking a cloth bundle straight at his face so his hands jerked up to catch it. In curiosity he tilted the bundle slowly one way and his head the other, back and forth, scouring the rags, before his eyes lit up in mixed delight and horror. "You found it, but he can't wear this, my best jacket. I wore it when we first met. Do you remember?" Two pairs of eyes attached to two younger family members sat at a heavy wooden kitchen table, rose simultaneously from two bowls of steaming stew. "Remember? How could I ever forget? I'm not dressing a scarecrow in my best jacket." "Why not?" The tone bore no sympathy. "You were as thin as a rake back then, and now you're dressing a rake just as thin. And just as weird." Giggles slipped out from behind the steam rising from the hot dinners. "Did Dad really look weird?" asked their son. "In that jacket, yes, but I figured that once I prized it off him, I could get him to look almost normal." "You mean at one time he looked normal?" chipped in their daughter. "Oh, shut up the lot of you," snapped Keith, gathering up the hand-me-down outfit and clomping back towards the door. "Why is he making a scarecrow?" asked the son. "He thinks it'll scare off the gang from the old barn," replied his sister. "More likely to relieve some twisted dream of his lost youth," shrugged their mother before shouting, "Do you want your stew now?" "No, keep it warm," called Keith over his shoulder. "I'll have it after he's dressed and in place." "You don't know how long I've been waiting to chuck that out," Kath said quietly to their children. "If I see that blasted jacket in this house again, I swear I'll scream to high heaven." And with that the back door slammed shut behind Keith after he had deposited a second scattering of soil across the floor. Down the hill in the village, old Mr. Harris twisted round to pull his front door shut behind him and secure his home of 8 decades. Thursday was the night when he would meet for a drink with pals from his youth. Now there were none left to meet, but he found it impossible not to go, as if he expected their ghosts to show up. These days he felt he had always been old Mr. Harris, and that the present villagers thought he had been born that way. No one had known either the younger Mr. Harris or child Master Harris, and even he now questioned whether they had ever existed. Giving the doorknob another good tug to reassure himself all was secured, he turned back round to set off, walking squarely into a well-built torso that hurtled towards him. "Oof!" groaned old Mr. Harris, crumpling up onto his side as the transiting body made an ungainly leap over him to land on all fours. Old Mr. Harris struggled to catch his breath as he lay on the ground. You all right?" asked a quiet, deep voice, uncertainly. "I'll see," whispered old Mr. Harris, slowly and faintly, "when I'm up again." Footsteps, more than the old man could count, clattered quickly towards them. "What have you done?" asked a girl's voice apprehensively. "I'll give you a hand up, mister," offered another young male voice. "Wait, I'll get there in my own time," warned old Mr. Harris. "You dropped your keys," said the girl's voice, and the old man heard them jangle as she picked them up off the pavement. After a pause of unknown length, old Mr. Harris felt ready. "Come on. we go," he ordered, and with support from hands he saw stretched out to him, he slowly regained his feet, groaning as his limbs straightened and his joints stretched. Upright at last, he turned round slowly to view a group considerably younger than himself, 2 girls and 2 boys. "Who hit me? What were you doing, going so fast and not looking?" "Sorry, mister," said the well-built collider. "I was running to catch them up." "Well, I don't think I've broken anything," said old Mr. Harris as he mentally flexed his limbs to check. "But be careful in future." "Yes, sorry," said the lad again. "Your keys," said the girl, a slight figure in a black anorak, handing them back to the old man. "Not dropped anything else?" she asked, glancing quickly at the collider. No, I think I've got everything, thank you," he answered, and after a pause commanded, "You take more care in future." "I will," answered the lad, and with no apparent damage other than to his feelings, once more the old man set off towards the pub for a restorative pint, while the gang turned to snigger at each other. Next, they made their way towards Topfield. Up in Topfield, in the glow of his torch, Keith could just make out the scarecrow's face grinning up at him. Its body was a 6-foot-tall cross made from an old rake and a wooden post lashed together, with another post for arms stretching out to each side. Now dressed in the old pair of trousers and shirt stuffed with straw, and topped with a once prized jacket, Keith had attached the face, a plastic mask of a grinning skull, to the head, setting it off with the straw hat. Raising the scarecrow from the ground, he poked the bottom post into a base he had buried in the ground. He stepped back and shone his torch on his creation to admire it. "You ought to frighten the hell out of them," he muttered. He stepped forward to take a closer look at his jacket, now ripped, faded and frayed. The material had once been striped cream and blue, with threads of sparkling gold running through it. Yeah, it was flashy in those days. Mind you, my friend, you must be the smartest scarecrow in the county. For a moment, he thought he felt the scarecrow's unsettling inked grin and gleaming eyes burning through him in reply. With an unbelieving shake of his head, Keith turned to make his way down to the village pub. After the ribbing from his family, he fancied a glass of something warm to cheer him up before going home for his stew. The chill of the crisp night touched his bones, and as he tramped down what would have once been furrows ploughed along the field, the wispy cloud parted sporadically to let the beams of the moon, the full moon, slip through. Old Mr. Harris struggled to push open the heavy door of the cross, having made his way there without further collisions. "Evening, Mr. Harris. Usual?" asked the cheery landlady, not even waiting for his reply before pulling the pump. "Yes, I'm a bit shaken," replied the pensioner, reaching into his inside left coat pocket. He paused, then reached into his right pocket, next his left outer pocket, and finally the corresponding pocket on his right. He stopped to think. "That's odd. I'm sure I put my wallet in my pocket." "Don't worry, Mr. Harris. I'll put it on a slate." No, I always pay my way," insisted the old man, checking and rechecking his pockets faster and faster. "It's not like you to be forgetful," reassured the landlady. "I'm sure I put it. I must have dropped it. Yes, when those kids—" "Kids?" asked the landlady quickly. 4 other locals in the bar looked round with sudden concern. "Yes, one of them bumped into me, not looking where he was going. I dropped my keys." "Might have known," she said, glancing at the other drinkers, who all acknowledged her unspoken thought. "You just sit down and enjoy that pint. We'll get you back your wallet." Up in Topfield, Scarecrow grinned as he watched the gang tumble over the gate on their way to celebrate in the derelict barn. Unwinding after the demanding discipline of the choreographed dance of deceit, mingling influences of smoke and liquor now gripped and dragged them further from the straight and narrow, and they stumbled towards him, zigzagging this way and that as they struggled to maintain direction. Looking down at his clothes, Scarecrow realised that his once sparkling attire was now too dowdy even to startle them. He would employ a different method. "I know just how to wring them out," he smirked. "Come closer, my children. That's right, closer still." And finally, they came upon the mild apparition, and for a second stood to gaze before falling about the earth in laughter. Not the reaction his artificer had sought. "That's right. Howl out your laughter, and when you're over and done with, we'll move on to the party. We've got a thrilling little caper ahead." And, as if they had heard Scarecrow, they wrenched him from his base and jostled him up the hill, still grinning as if the head of some otherworldly religious procession. Now 5, the gang fell through the collapsed doorway of the tumble-down barn and flopped onto the ground, jettisoning Scarecrow, who fell to recline against a stone wall. "Shh! Ooh, it's cold in here. Light that fire and start a blaze," commanded Scarecrow in an icy whisper. And again, unconsciously, they obeyed, one of the lads emptying lighter fuel over the relics of a previous fire, which on lighting conjured up sparking flames that soon licked the stone walls with its crimson tongues. "Awash with blood, just how I like it," hissed Scarecrow. "Now let the ritual begin." And with that, the girl produced the talked-about wallet from a pocket of her zipper jacket, flipping it open and sliding out a wad of notes. The others gathered round, reaching out to grab a share of the plunder, but the girl snatched them back close to her body. The others disputed this and berated her, reaching out and pulling her, shoving first her and then each other, as each sought their share of the stolen cash. "That's right, demand what's yours, fight for your fair lot, my children," urged Scarecrow, now, unnoticed by the gang, standing upright, unsupported. The rush of ingested chemicals quickened the mutation of their superficial camaraderie into greed-fueled hate and thuggery. "Very good, my children," praised Scarecrow. "Louder, angrier, crueler!" And they obeyed without question, jostling and shouting, hissing and spitting, hitting and kicking each other. "There is nothing I need to drink more than raw hatred." And their anger and violence grew further as flailing arms shoved and pushed and legs kicked and kneed until one clenched fist swung back and began the long, high arc of a full and fatal punch, until in the heat they froze. The flames from the fire rose up like serpents, and the walls were now awash in the glow of blood. As one, the youngsters turned to face the fire, out of which towered Scarecrow, now as tall and broad as the barn, jaws agape, in predatory grin of a ravenous beast. "I thirst for the bile of your blood," shrieked Scarecrow, fully audible to the young people, now still, silent, and paralysed by fear. The deathly white jaws, fringed with the coiling horns of a goat, growing to crowd all else out from their vision as its crimson tongue lashed and the monster howled. "Let me crunch your bones! Let me drain every drop of hate-drenched blood from your veins!" The youngsters could only imagine their own screams as, immobile, fixed to the dirt floor, the cavernous mouth enveloped them. Outsized incisors pierced their flesh to soak the walls in jets of blood, and millstone molars crushed and ground the bones to dust, amid frenzied gnashing and wailing that filled any space unfilled with bestial frenzy. As he crossed the road to enter the pub, Keith turned quickly to look back up the hill, curious as to the burst of sound that had disturbed him. He stopped in the middle of the street, but his heightened attention detected only silence. Nothing. He resumed his path, forced to walk round a badly parked van to reach the entrance of the pub. "Evening," he chirped as he entered, to a response anything but chirpy. "Blimey, it's like a morgue." "And with good reason," relayed the landlady. "Old Mr. Harris has been mugged." "No." "Yes, and by your favourite gang of thugs." "I know they're a nuisance, but mugging?" "Knocked him over and snatched his wallet," added one of the regulars. Keith stood silent for a moment until the clinking knife and fork of a diner back in the depths of the bar could be heard. "Well, come on," urged Keith. "We know where to find them." And the bar stools and heavy wooden chairs scraped the flagstones as the posse dismounted to set off. But they were unready for the outer door to scrape open and the appearance of young, wan faces, 4 of them. "We've brought back your wallet," announced the thin girl in her thin voice, addressing old Mr. Harris. "Well, how generous of you," responded the old man warmly, accepting his wallet from the girl's outstretched hand. He opened it up to see its contents just as he had left them. The members of the posse all glanced at each other in uncertainty. "Everything seems to be here," added the old man. "Let me treat you to something for your honesty and taking the trouble to bring it back." "Thank you, but we've got to get home," said the girl. "We've got to get up for college in the morning." And as one, the 4 figures turned and shuffled out the door. As it closed slowly behind them, Keith, the landlady, and the regulars froze in bewilderment, while old Mr. Harris, full of life, rechecked his wallet, delighted at its restoration. The clank of knife and fork on plate, followed by a cheery, "Oh, that was a fright to remember," returned everyone to their senses. And the landlady hurried from around the bar to clear away the diner's plate. "My compliments to the chef," he boomed to the surprised landlady, used to dealing with all kinds of customers, but taken aback by enthusiasm for the plain pub grub. "Thank you, sir," she replied, and after a moment of confusion, "Are you visiting?" "No, down troubleshooting to clear up a mess, and now got a long way back up, and thanks to you, fully fueled by that hearty meal." The landlady felt there was nothing she could do but stand and watch as the thin, almost skeletal, wiry-haired man stood up and swiftly pulled on his jacket. "Thank you, landlady. Now I must be on my way." And the gaze of the whole pub tracked the stranger as he nimbly threaded his way round empty tables towards the bar. He stopped in front of Keith, who felt his keen grin and gleaming eyes burning through him. "Don't be too hard on the young uns. There's not one drop of bad blood in any of them." And then he shot to the pub door, passing through it slickly and silently. Keith was not just bewildered, but fully flabbergasted. This spectral stranger was sporting his jacket. His jacket! Striped cream and blue with threads of sparkling gold running through it, as clean and pristine as the moment it first caught his eye in the trendy boutique. "Hold on!" shouted Keith. "Wait!" And he stumbled after the stranger, almost hitting his face on the heavy door, which, as usual, clunked open only after a hefty shove. Squeezing through the gap, Keith almost collided with the side of the badly parked van outside. "Contract cleaning," boasted the blood-red logo. "Decontamination, purification, eradication of infestations." It took several moments for Keith to clock that the van was still there, but that its owner, in his resplendent jacket was not. A glistening caught his eye. He turned to see the spectral figure behind the fence opposite, leaning against the rail. "That's my jacket," shouted Keith. "Finders keepers," replied the spectre, still grinning, then twisting and vanishing into the bushes that had colonised the bottom edges of Top Field. "Wait!" called Keith, turning and lurching across the road, running up to the fence and vaulting over it. Surprised at his own agility, Keith paused for breath before plunging in pursuit into the dense shrubs. Through the branches Keith crashed, listening keenly for footsteps above the rustling of the leafy limbs that lashed him as he clambered from bush to bush. Slowly he made his way uphill, scanning for the crackling of twigs and snapping of branches ahead. Frequently stumbling as creepers stretched out to trip him and low branches toppled him, Keith plodded on in the darkness, aware that he was in Top Field, but unaware of his path through the overgrown fringe. It seemed to lead on forever until his progress was blocked abruptly by a solid barrier, extending out of reach from side to side, top to bottom. The side of the old barn. Keith stepped forward to touch the stone wall. It felt strangely smooth and solid, dry and cold. He stroked it with his palms and slid them along in search of the wall's edge, sliding along after them, led solely by touch. On and on went his fingers until they slid from solid stone across empty air. Keith stopped and turned his face to the open field, noticing a glow spreading out into the dark expanse. Puzzled and curious as to its source, Keith lunged round the corner of the barn into dazzling white light streaming out from a wide doorway. Somehow the front of the barn had been completely repaired, and in place of the gaping hole was a perfectly constructed doorway. Astounded, Keith found himself drawn through it, and inside the barn, now illuminated entirely and evenly from an unseen, unseated source. "Miraculous!" Keith gasped, gazing up at the barn's vaulted roof, which had assumed the stateliness of a cathedral. "We certainly scrubbed up well this evening," added the thin voice of the bejacketed contractor, leaning against a clean stone wall. "But who?" asked Keith. "Ask the young uns," replied the spectre. Keith could only stare, dazzled by light and splendour. Then, after an unmeasurable pause, the figure by the wall vanished and out blinked the light. In the black, as Keith's eyes adjusted, he heard steps crunch the soil outside. "Finders keepers," the words echoed in his ears. He turned again and headed back through the doorway and out into Top Field. Footsteps. Keith followed without hindrance from bush or branch. A break in the now thicker cloud let a moonbeam slip through to pick out a slight, shifting, glistening figure running frantically up the field. Keith adjusted his direction to follow it as the moonbeam faded and the figure disappeared. He carried on, one heavy step after another, and something grabbed his ankle. A bramble? He shook it free and stumbled on. Something else clutched at his leg. Then a hand pulled his coat. Other hands lunged and held him, pulling him so that he could not advance. As hard as he fought, Keith could not move, and he heard the muttering of voices, all converging so that no words were clear. One overly powerful tug pulled his foot from under him, and he fell forward onto the hard earth, tugged in all directions from head to foot, and voices, the bleating of animals all around. Keith jerked his head round to see the contractor grinning down at him. "Finders keepers!" Keith blinked, and it was the skull grinning. He blinked again, and it was a white goat, teeth bared and horns curled on each side. Keith closed his eyes and slumped as hands let go. Bleating ceased, and hooves galloped into the distance. A chime of the church bell faded as Keith's eyes flicked open, leaving the stillness of the night. Keith propped himself up on his right arm and saw his discarded jacket. He snatched it and stood up, examining the garment, now clean, pristine and glinting in the light. "Who'd believe it?" gasped Keith. "Found it, kept it," whispered a voice in his mind. Keith looked round, but there was no other trace of Scarecrow. He noticed hoofprints in the ground. A shiver passed through him. Keith raced up to the farmhouse. Somehow he'd regained his breath, and he reached it with ease, pulling open the door, so excited and accidentally slamming it, wrenching the hinges a little more from the frame. Mud scattered far and wide across the floor. "Kath, look, my jacket, as perfect as when we first met!" Shrieking crows rocketed from the old barn roof. Shutters rattled their chains outside the old cross. Old Mr. Harris tugged his blankets tighter. The young'uns judded deep in dreams, and flinging the back door from its frame and glancing the overblown moon on its ascent, the unleashed scream pierced high heaven.